The engine sputtered once, a pathetic cough against the biting winter air, and then died. Anaya rested her forehead against the cold steering wheel of her ancient pickup, the silence on the lonely forest road suddenly vast and menacing. One dead engine, one dying phone, one blind date she was now officially, spectacularly late for. She had resisted this for months. Her friend, Maya, had been relentless. He's different, Anaya. Stable. A good man, after a year of rebuilding her life from the ashes of a marriage to a man who is none of those things. Stable sounded like a foreign country she wasn't sure she had the visa for. She sighed, the puff of her breath a white cloud in the frigid cab. Of course, this would happen. The universe enjoyed its little ironies. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped out, the hem of her dark green dress instantly catching the wind. Her thin beige trench coat was no match for the cold that seeped in from the surrounding woods. Headlights sliced through the darkness behind her. Anaya's body went rigid. Her hand instinctively went to the tire iron she kept tucked between the driver's seat and the console. This was how stories started on the late-night news. A lone woman, a broken-down car, a dark road. A black SUV, sleek and silent as a panther, slowed to a stop. It was the kind of vehicle that didn't belong on a road this neglected, its polished surface drinking the dim light. The driver's side door opened, and a man emerged. He was tall, encased in a dark, exquisitely tailored overcoat that fell to his knees. Even from a distance, he moved with an unnerving economy of motion, as if the world rearranged itself to make way for him. He stopped a dozen feet away, his hands visible. A deliberate gesture of non-aggression that somehow felt more threatening than outright hostility. Trouble. His voice was low, a gravelly timbre that cut through the wind. Anaya kept her hand near the tire iron. I've got it handled. A corner of his mouth tilted, a fleeting, humorless expression. With what? Anger? He took a step closer, and she could see his face more clearly in the glow of his headlights. Sharp, aristocratic features, dark eyes that seemed to absorb all light and reflect none, and an air of absolute stillness that was more commanding than any shout. Pop the hood. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of what would happen next. Something in his calm certainty made her hesitate. He didn't look like a predator. He looked like something far more complex and, perhaps, far more dangerous. She weighed her options. Freeze out here and wait for a tow truck that might never come, or trust the stranger in the $1,000 coat. She walked to the front of the pickup and fumbled with the latch, pulling the hood open with a rusty groan. He came to stand beside her, and the subtle scent of sandalwood and something clean, like gin, drifted from him. He shrugged off his overcoat, draping it over the fender with a careless grace that spoke of immense wealth. Underneath, he wore a charcoal suit that was a masterpiece of tailoring, fitting his broad shoulders perfectly. At his wrist, as he leaned over the engine, a sliver of intricate, dark ink peeked from beneath the starched white cuff of his shirt. She watched his hands. They were beautiful hands, long-fingered and steady, but with a harshness to the knuckles that suggested they were familiar with more than just boardrooms. He moved with a surgeon's precision, his gaze analytical as he scanned the engine block. Distributor cap, he said after a moment, his voice devoid of surprise. It's cracked. Anaya leaned in, her eyes following his pointing finger. She saw the tiny fracture in the plastic. Can you fix it? No, he said simply. But I can get you to a garage. I can't just leave my truck. It was a piece of junk, but it was her piece of junk. Her only real asset, besides the clothes on her back. He looked at her then, his dark eyes meeting hers for the first time. The intensity in his gaze was a physical force, pinning her in place. He wasn't just looking at her. He was assessing her, cataloging every detail from her worn-out boots to the determined set of her jaw. I have a roll of electrical tape in my trunk, he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. It's a temporary fix. It might get you into town. It might not. He didn't wait for her permission, walking back to his SUV. While he was gone, Anaya let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This man was an anomaly. He exuded a kind of predatory calm she had only ever seen in nature documentaries. He returned with the tape and went to work, his movements efficient and sure. He wrapped the cracked cap with a neatness that was almost obsessive. "Try it now," he commanded, wiping his hands on a silk handkerchief he produced from his pocket. She slid back into the driver's seat, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She turned the key. The engine sputtered, caught, and then roared to life with a shudder. Relief washed over her so intensely it made her dizzy. She got out of the truck, leaving the engine running. "Thank you," she said, her voice sounding thin in the cold air. "I don't know how to." "You're on your way to Shinjuku?" he asked, cutting her off. She nodded. "A restaurant there. Kiku." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in the depths of his eyes. A shadow of what? Annoyance? Resignation? "Drive carefully," he said. He picked up his overcoat, shaking off the dust from her decrepit truck without a flicker of distaste, and walked back to his SUV. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't offer his. She watched as the black vehicle disappeared down the road, its red taillights swallowed by the oppressive dark. For a moment, she just stood there, the rumble of her own engine a reassuring vibration beneath her feet. The encounter had been surreal, leaving an unsettling hum under her skin. She told herself it was just the adrenaline of being stranded and the relief of being saved. But her internal voice, the one that had kept her safe for the past year, knew it was more. It was him, the man with the cold eyes and the ink on his skin. Shaking it off, she got back in the truck and drove, her hands tight on the wheel. The temporary fix held. She navigated the last few miles into the city, the glittering towers of Shinjuku rising like a promise of a different world. The restaurant, Kiku, was on the 40th floor of one of those towers. It was a place of quiet, understated luxury, all dark wood and soft lighting, with a panoramic view of the city's electric heartbeat. A hostess led her through the hushed dining room to a secluded table by the window. A man was already seated, his back to her, looking out at the sprawling metropolis below. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. That was when she made the mistake of looking up. Her breath caught in her throat. The hostess murmured a polite greeting to the man, and he turned. The air crackled. His dark, impenetrable eyes widened for a fraction of a second, the only sign of his shock. It was him, the man from the road. The stranger who had fixed her truck with a roll of electrical tape and the detached competence of a bomb disposal expert. He was her blind date. Her stable, different good man. And in his eyes, Anaya saw the exact same, horrified recognition she felt mirrored in her own. The silence that fell between them was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of a dozen unspoken questions, the most pressing of which was what kind of man, arranged for a blind date, carried himself with the lethal grace of a predator. "Anaya," he said, his voice the same low timbre she'd heard on that dark road. He said her name differently than anyone else had. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation of a deeply unfortunate fact. She could only nod, her throat suddenly dry. She slid into the chair opposite him, the plush leather a stark contrast to the ripped vinyl of her truck's bench seat. The city lights glittered below, a galaxy of possibilities, but all she could see was the unnerving stillness of the man in front of her. "You're Kaido," she stated, the name Maya had given her feeling foreign and inadequate on her tongue. "I am," he confirmed. A waiter appeared, silent as a ghost, and poured water into their glasses. Kaido didn't look at him, but the waiter's deference was palpable. He moved around Kaido as if he were a sleeping tiger. "Your truck," Kaido began, his voice a low murmur that wouldn't carry past their table. "Did it get you here without any more trouble?" "It did." "Thank you again." The polite words felt absurd. The entire situation was absurd. This man, with his bespoke suit and the aura of absolute control, had had his hands covered in the grease of her engine less than an hour ago. "It was a temporary fix," he said, his gaze unwavering. "It will fail again. You should have it replaced." It sounded less like advice and more like a diagnosis. The conversation stalled, hovering in the tense air between them. Anaya searched for something to say, something normal to bridge the chasm of strangeness. So, she started, her voice a little too bright, Maya tells me you're in imports. A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, crossed his features. That's one word for it, he said. And what did she tell you about yourself? The question caught her off guard. Me? I'm a librarian. At the city's public archive, she felt the need to add, it's quiet. I like quiet. Do you? He said, and it wasn't a question. His eyes scanned her face, lingering on the faint, faded scar near her temple from a time when her life had been anything but quiet. She resisted the urge to touch it, to hide it. His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch, stripping away the careful layers she'd built around herself. He knew she was lying, or, at least, not telling the whole truth. Quiet was what she craved, not what she was. What she was a survivor. Their food arrived, a procession of exquisite dishes she couldn't have named or afforded. She picked at a piece of delicate sashimi, the silence stretching between them, thick and suffocating. This was a mistake. A colossal one. Maya had no idea who this man was. Anaya had no idea either, not really, but her instincts were screaming. This was arranged by my subordinate, Kaido said suddenly, as if reading her mind. He has an antiquated notion that I require companionship. He said the word with a particular distaste, as if it were a weakness. He was told you were a woman of substance. Resilient. Is that what they're calling divorced and broke these days? Anaya countered, the word sharper than she intended. His gaze didn't waver. It's what I would call a woman who gets out of a dead truck on a dark road with a tire iron in her hand, ready to fight. Her fork clattered against her plate. He had seen it. He had seen her fear and her readiness to meet it with violence. And he hadn't judged it. He had named it. Before she could respond, two men approached their table. They were not waiters. They wore ill-fitting suits and expressions of smug belligerence. They stopped beside Kaido, ignoring Anaya completely. Tanaka, the lead man said, his voice a low sneer. Fancy seeing you here. I thought you preferred places with more privacy. Kaido didn't look up from his plate. He carefully picked up a piece of tuna with his chopsticks. I was enjoying the view, Kenji, he said, his voice dangerously soft. Now you're spoiling it. The old man is getting impatient, Kenji pressed, taking a step closer. He feels you've been disrespectful. He sent us to remind you of your obligations. Tell him, Kaido said, finally lifting his eyes. The cold fury in them was terrifying. It was a controlled, arctic rage that promised swift and terrible consequences. That my obligations are my own. And that if he ever sends his dogs to my table again, I will return them to him in pieces. Kenji laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Big words. But you're alone. His eyes flickered to Anaya for the first time, a dismissive, lewd glance. And you have company. What happened next was a blur of precise, economical motion. Kaido moved so fast Anaya barely registered it. One moment he was seated, the next he was on his feet. He didn't throw a punch. He simply stepped forward, his hand darting out to grip Kenji's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. Kenji screamed, a high, strangled sound that was cut short as Kaido twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. The other man froze, his face draining of color. The entire restaurant had gone silent. Diners stared, frozen in a mixture of fear and shock. Get out, Kaido said, his voice a low hiss. He released Kenji, who scrambled backward, clutching his broken wrist and whimpering. The two men fled, stumbling over themselves in their haste. Kaido stood for a moment, a figure of absolute menace in the suddenly silent room. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, his expression unreadable. Then he sat back down as if nothing had happened. He picked up his chopsticks and looked directly at Anaya. I apologize for the interruption, he said calmly. Anaya's heart was hammering against her ribs. Her hands were shaking. She should have been terrified. She was. But she was also something else. Fascinated. In the chaos, in that moment of stark violence, she had seen the truth of him. And she hadn't run. When Kenji had looked at her, some instinct had made her subtly shift her weight, her hand hovering over the heavy, silver-plated butter knife on the table. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was something. A choice. He saw her glance at the knife. A deep, unreadable expression crossed his face. "You should have run," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. That was the moment everything changed. The blind date was over. This was something else entirely. He paid the bill in cash, leaving a stack of bills that could have covered her rent for 6 months. He led her out of the restaurant, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was proprietary. A claim. "I'm taking you home," he said in the elevator, his tone leaving no room for argument. But he didn't drive her back to her dilapidated apartment on the edge of the city. The sleek black SUV cut through the heart of Tokyo, heading towards the most exclusive, expensive real estate in the country. He took her to a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a glittering skyscraper, a palace of glass and steel suspended in the night sky. "You can't stay at your apartment," he said, closing the heavy door behind them. The click of the lock sounded final. "They saw you with me. They know your face. It's no longer safe." The apartment was vast and minimalist, furnished with an aesthetic's taste for quality over comfort. The only warmth came from a fireplace crackling in a stone hearth. Anaya walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out beneath her like a carpet of fallen stars. It was a world away from her cramped, drafty apartment. "Why?" she asked, turning to face him. "Why are you doing this?" He was standing by a wet bar, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. "You were at my table," he said, as if that explained everything. He handed her a glass. The whiskey was smooth and smoky, burning a slow, clean trail down her throat. "That makes you my responsibility." "I'm not your responsibility, Kaido." "Tonight," he said, his eyes dark and serious, "you are." He showed her to a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment. It was luxurious but impersonal, like a high-end hotel suite. She knew she should be trying to leave, calling Maya, calling the police. But who would she call? And what would she say? That a man had broken another man's wrist in a fancy restaurant and then brought her to a penthouse to keep her safe. They would think she was crazy. Or worse, complicit. She spent a restless night, the unfamiliar luxury of the silk sheets doing little to soothe her frayed nerves. The next day, Kaido was gone when she awoke. A quiet, older woman who introduced herself as the housekeeper informed her that Mr. Tanaka had arranged for clothes to be delivered for her. Anaya found boxes from designer boutiques stacked in the closet, filled with clothes that cost more than her truck. It felt like being kept, like being a bird in a very beautiful cage. For 2 days, she lived in that suspended reality. She explored the penthouse, a monument to a man who seemed to have no personal life, only business. There were no photographs, no sentimental objects, just art, books on strategy and history, and an unnerving sense of control. In his office, a room he kept locked but she managed to get into by jimmying the simple lock with a bobby pin from her own coat, she found what she was looking for. And what she wished she hadn't. It was a file, left carelessly on his massive mahogany desk. It wasn't about business. It was about a woman. Her name was Akari. There were photographs of her, a beautiful, smiling woman with bright, laughing eyes. And then there were other photos. Crime scene photos. Akari, no longer smiling, in the wreckage of a car bombing. The date on the police report was 5 years ago. A rival family had targeted her to get to him. The report stated he had been the one to pull her from the fire. Too late. His wound wasn't just a failure to protect. It was a scar he relived every day. That was why he was so cold, so controlled. He had walled off his heart so no one else could ever become a target. And now here she was, Anaya, at his table. The realization chilled her to the bone. She wasn't a guest. She was a liability. A ghost of a past mistake he was terrified of repeating. This wasn't about protecting her. This was about managing a threat. That evening, he came home late, looking exhausted. The sharp lines of his face were etched with fatigue. He found her in the main living area, standing by the window, the file on Akari clutched in her hand. His body went still when he saw it. The air grew thick with a tension so profound it was hard to breathe. "You shouldn't have gone in my office," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You should have told me," she countered, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "You should have told me what I was walking into." "I told you to run," he shot back, his control finally cracking. A raw, ragged pain bled through his voice. "I told you." From the very beginning, he walked towards her, his steps deliberate, predatory. He stopped right in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "They will see you as a weakness, a vulnerability to be exploited. Just like her." "I am not her." Anaya's voice rose, defiant. "You're right," he whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. He reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was electric, a jolt of lightning in the charged atmosphere. "You are not. And that is what terrifies me." The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than any declaration of love. It was a raw admission of his fear, his vulnerability. The next day, she proved him right. He had to leave for a meeting, one he couldn't miss. He left 2 of his men, silent sentinels in dark suits, posted outside the penthouse door. Anaya, feeling caged and restless, told them she was going down to the building's gym. She needed to feel her own strength, to burn off the nervous energy. They were reluctant, but she was persuasive. One of them escorted her down in the elevator. The gym was nearly empty. She was on the treadmill, trying to outrun her thoughts, when a man sat down on the weight bench nearby. It was Kenji, the man from the restaurant, his arm now in a pristine white cast. His smile was a venomous slash across his face. "We meet again," he sneered. The boss's new pet. Anaya's blood ran cold. She hit the emergency stop button on the treadmill. "What do you want?" Just to deliver a message, he stood up, and 2 more men emerged from the locker room, blocking the exit. The old man doesn't like to be ignored. And he doesn't like loose ends. She backed away, her eyes darting around for an escape, a weapon. All she saw were polished machines and mirrored walls. Her escort was gone, likely lured away or incapacitated. Kenji lunged. She dodged, years of fending off her drunken ex-husband's clumsy advances having honed her reflexes. She grabbed a 5-pound dumbbell from a nearby rack, her hand closing around the cold metal. It was heavy, solid. "You're making this difficult," Kenji snarled, advancing again. She didn't hesitate. She swung the dumbbell with all her might, connecting with the side of his head. He staggered back, surprise and pain warring on his face. The other 2 men charged. She threw the weight at one, catching him in the chest and knocking him off balance. She ran. She didn't make it to the door. The second man grabbed her from behind, his arm wrapping around her throat, cutting off her air. Stars exploded behind her eyes. Desperate, she stomped down hard on his instep with her heel. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench herself free. She scrambled for the door, but Kenji was there, his face a mask of fury, a thin trickle of blood running from his temple. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like claws. The gym doors burst open. It was Kaito. His face was a thundercloud of black rage. He took in the scene in an instant. The 2 men, Kenji's hand on her, the fear in her eyes. The cold, controlled man was gone. In his place was something primal and terrifying. He moved with a speed that was inhuman. He didn't just neutralize the threat. He dismantled it. He broke the other man's arm with a sharp, brutal twist. He disabled the second with a precise, crippling blow to the knee. Then he turned to Kenji. He took Anaya's arm, gently pulling her behind him, shielding her with his body. He looked at Kenji, and the look in his eyes was a death sentence. "You touched her," Kaito said, his voice a chillingly soft whisper. What he did next was not a fight. It was an execution. It was swift, brutal, and utterly silent. When it was over, Kenji was a broken heap on the floor, and Kaido didn't have a single hair out of place. He turned to Anaya, his chest rising and falling heavily. There was a small cut on his cheek, where one of the men had landed a lucky blow. Without thinking, she reached up and touched the cut, her fingers brushing against his skin. "You're bleeding," she whispered. He caught her hand, his grip surprisingly gentle. The inferno in his eyes banked, replaced by something deep and raw. "Seeing them touch you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "I would burn this city to the ground." She didn't pull her hand away. In that moment, standing in the wreckage of the violence he had wrought for her, she crossed a line she could never uncross. "I told myself I was staying because I had no choice," she confessed, her voice barely audible. That was a lie. The final confrontation came 2 nights later. They knew it was coming. Kaido's enemies were not the type to forgive the humiliation he'd dealt them. They would come for him, and they would use her to do it. Kaido wanted to send her away, to a safe house in the mountains. She refused. "They'll find me," she said, her voice firm. "Or they'll just wait until I come back. I'm not running. I'm not your weakness, Kaido. Let me be your strength." He looked at her for a long time, his gaze searching her face. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. The plan was simple. They would leak information that Kaido was sending her away that night. A convoy of 2 cars would leave the building. She would be in the second car. They knew the rival clan would hit the convoy on the bridge, a place with no escape routes. But Anaya wouldn't be in the second car. She would be in the first with Kaido, and the second car would be filled with his best men. It was a trap, using her as the bait. As they prepared to leave, Kaido handed her a small, cold, heavy object. A pistol. "Do you know how to use this?" She thought of the tire iron, the dumbbell. "I'm a fast learner." He showed her, his hands covering hers, guiding her fingers. The brief, professional touch was more intimate than a kiss. "You don't aim to wound," he said, his voice low and intense in her ear. "You aim to stop the threat. Do you understand, Anaya?" "I understand," she said, her voice not wavering. The attack came exactly as they'd predicted. On the bridge, cars screeched to a halt, blocking them in. Men in dark clothes swarmed their vehicle, weapons drawn. But they swarmed the wrong car. From their position ahead, Kaido and Anaya watched as his men erupted from the second vehicle, catching their attackers in a pincer. The night exploded in gunfire. It was chaos, but one of the attackers broke through, his target clear. He ran towards their car, his gun raised. Kaido was already moving, exiting the vehicle, his own weapon firing with deadly accuracy. But another attacker came from his blind spot. Anaya saw him, the man, aiming not at Kaido's men, but at Kaido himself. Time seemed to slow. There was no one else to stop him. Kaido was occupied. This was her moment. Her choice. She raised the pistol with both hands, just as Kaido had shown her. She lined up the sights on the man's center mass. She remembered his words. "You aim to stop the threat." She squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed her back against the seat. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space of the car. The man crumpled to the ground. She had done it. She had taken a life to save his. A cold, clear certainty settled over her. She did not regret it. When the last shot faded, an eerie silence fell over the bridge, broken only by the distant wail of sirens. Kaido wrenched her car door open, his eyes wild with fear. "Anaya." He saw the gun still in her hand, the smoke curling from the barrel, the dead man on the pavement. He looked from the man back to her, and his expression shifted from fear to a stunned, profound awe. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't say anything about the man she had killed. He reached in, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw his entire world reordering itself around her. "You are not a weakness," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He said her name, and it sounded like a vow. "Anaya. You are the only thing that is real." The cost was absolute. Her old life, The library, her small apartment, her friend Maya was gone. Erased. To protect Maya, Anaya would have to disappear from her life forever. The woman who had left her apartment for a blind date was a ghost. Weeks later, she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, looking out over the glittering expanse of Tokyo. The city was his territory, his empire. And now, in a way, it was hers. Her old pickup truck had been replaced. Her debts had been paid. Her past had been buried. She heard him approach, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. He came to stand behind her, not touching, but his presence was a solid, reassuring wall at her back. He didn't ask if she was staying. He knew the answer in the cold steel of the gun she'd fired, in the steady gaze she met him with now. He had seen the darkness in her, the same survival instinct that drove him, and he had not flinched. He had claimed it. She didn't say she would stay. She didn't have to. The choice had been made on that bridge, in a moment of fire and blood. She turned from the window, away from the ghost of the woman she used to be, and looked at him. She looked at her future. It was dangerous, it was violent, and it was uncertain. But for the first time in her life, it was hers. And it was real.